Oh yeah,
Yes.
there'll probably be some joiners in the next 2 or 3 minutes, as usually happens, Henry, as you know. So, right, here we go.
Hey.
Here we are. Good morning, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. If you've just joined, if you could mute, there's a bit of buzzing noise going on. Thanks, Terry, for muting. JQ, thanks for muting. Thanks, Bryn. Thanks, Bobby. Thanks, everyone. Morning, Natalia. Morning, Richard. Morning, John. Morning, Chris. Morning, Christos. Great to see you all. If you've just joined, if you could mute, that would be excellent. Thank you.
Hi, Bobby. Hi, Chris.
Henry saying hi to everybody.
Porrick.
Morning, Sophie. Morning, Podrick.
Aaron.
Terry's on as well. David Brooks. Morning, David. If you can just mute, that would be great. Okay.
John.
Thomas. There we go. Con as well. Morning, Con. Morning, Thomas. Morning, Craig. All these latecomers. Morning, Peter.
Right. David.
Thanks for joining.
Nice to see you.
There we go. Right, I think.
Thomas, we'll see you this afternoon, sir.
There we go. Right. Okay. Excellent. Let's begin. Thanks everyone for joining today's session. We're delighted to have Neil Walsh from Prospect Union, and as usual, this is going to be hopefully a very informative and friendly. I've said to Neil we're going to be a very friendly bunch. As usual, if you want to raise a hand, then please do. There will be Q&A towards the end. We will open up the chat room and open that up, so which is all good. And I think if you could put your thumbs up to say we're being recorded, everybody's happy. Natalia, Chris, Bobby, everybody, we're being recorded. Cheers, Chris. Thanks, everyone. That's great. There's a couple. Morning, John. Morning, Stephen. We are recording now, so there we go. Right, without any further ado, I'll pass on to Henry, who will give you a brief overview of today's session. But thanks, Neil, in advance for your attendance. Over to you, Henry.
This isn't about me, actually. This is about Neil, who many of you will know because Neil's got quite a history of being in pensions with various unions. And before that, I think I'm right in saying you were a GAD. Were you not a pupil of Mr. Andrew Young's? Is that right?
I was. Andrew was one of my first bosses, yes, back in the late 90s.
So we had a great little afternoon sitting on the beach after a conference session about CDC only a few weeks ago, and along who should come but the said Andy Young, which is very nice. So a bit of an old man's chinwig between me and Andrew, and you were very much a young man of the free. I have a number of questions, but obviously delighted to hear other people breaking in at any time. My first question is really just to ask you what it's like being a pensions officer in one of Britain's larger unions.
Oh, thanks, Henry. Well, it's very enjoyable. As you say, I used to work at the Government Actuaries Department, where I was a volunteer, a lay rep for Prospect and one of its predecessor unions, IPMS. And just moving across then to working for Prospect meant that what I had been doing kind of voluntarily on a lay basis outside of working hours, suddenly they started to pay me for doing. So that was quite a nice change. But it's also, you know, where me and my colleagues know the trade unions, we are kind of like the bureaucrats of the movement. We're paid for our advice and things like that, but all of the policies of a trade union will, of course, come democratically. Either national policies will be set by National Conference of Trade Unions, and when it comes to the policies of any branch that is associated with any employer, you know, that will be set by the branch committee of the particular union, you know, in line with what its members want. So just being the pension officer of a trade union absolutely does not mean we set the pension policy of that trade union.
So what do you do?
Well, we advise. at a very, very high level, we could be dealing with an individual member who's got a problem because they disagree with the application of the rules of their pension scheme. At an employer level, we could be advising on a statutory consultation about a change in pension provision that has been proposed by the company. Nationally, you can be lobbying about what Prospect does a lot of research and campaigning about the size of the gender pensions gap, for example, or about the lack of pre-97 indexation for our members who've got benefits in the pension protection funds. So there's a wide variety of things you could be doing, but you're only ever advising either an individual member, branch committee, or the national union itself.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's great that you're doing all the individual stuff, but I know that you do bring out papers from time to time. I read one recently about the pension gender gap, which was fun, being on the right side of the gender gap, obviously, as a male. And I fear that we have far too many men on this call and not enough women. But to even things up a little bit, can you explain what the paper said so that we do get a bit of a lesson from you?
Yeah, well, the main reason why we started publishing research on the size of the gender pensions gap was because, quite simply, there wasn't any official estimate. It was obvious that it was going to be larger than the gender pay gap because the gender pay gap drives gender pensions gap. And on top of that, you've got some, in the past, state pension inequality and also the impact of caring responsibilities. But there was just no figure. And without that figure on the size of the gap, it's difficult to generate the kind of campaign you need to try and address it. So for years, we've been publishing a report just based on an analysis of the DWP's Family Resources Survey, just getting figures that do exist, put out into the public domain, showing the scale of the challenge that the gender pensions gap is over twice the size of the gender pay gap, for example. And actually, the first recommendation we put in every report was trying to put our report out of business, just recommending that government publishes its own estimate of the gender pensions gap, which it has been doing more recently, though that's based on an analysis of the Wealth and Assets Survey, and we've got 2 results of that, and it is showing that the underlying statistics based on that data source are extremely variable. There's a lot of uncertainty underpinning them, so it's kind of hard maybe to use that as a measure of how we're doing in terms of closing the gender pensions gap. So we might have to continue publishing our estimate, which is more one based on incomes from the Family Resources Survey for a little while yet.
Do you see any signs that things are getting better?
Yeah, well, certainly, the 2016 state pension changes absolutely made a big difference, and they'll bring forward when we're going to see equality, gender equality in the state pension, which is, a big thing. Gender pay gap itself has been coming down for a long time, and there's a lot of progress. There's a lot of, priority on that, which will feed indirectly through to the gender pensions gap over time as well. But the number one thing is we need to have better recognition of caring responsibilities. It's a carer's pension gap, really. For as long as women disproportionately undertake caring responsibilities, and therefore they're not building up a workplace pension when they're either not in paid employment at all or working part-time because of those caring responsibilities. And until the pension system reflects that better, we're not going to finally close it. And hopefully the Pensions Commission has recognised, obviously, that there is a problem with the gender pensions gap, and we've all been putting in our solutions to that, and hopefully that will emerge from that process.
Well, this is a pretty nasty segue, but I'm going to try it because we're putting together a CDC scheme. We had a long debate about whether it could be making things fairer for women. We concluded that the only thing we could really do as a proprietor of a CDC scheme was to have unisex annuities, which we have moved to. The gentleman behind that's on this call, Chris Plumford. As a starting point on CDC, do you have a view on this? Or do you...
Well, there is a way in which it could actually be a significant help. If you're talking about CDC as being an improvement over DC, currently a lot of DC schemes, especially for good employers, I don't know, I can imagine why it started off. It probably seems like it's a good thing to encourage people to save more. But there are an awful lot of contribution structures for traditional DC schemes that have tiered contribution, either matching contribution rates, or the more the member puts in, the more the employer puts in. It sounds good, doesn't it? Except for a couple of years ago, we just, with our biggest employers, asked for the statistics. What are the proportion of men in your workplace who pay enough to get the highest matching employer contribution, and what are the proportion of women that pay enough in that matching DC structure to get the highest matching contribution from the employer. And invariably, men were more easily able to get that higher matching contribution rate. And, I didn't do any research into why, but thinking about it, it was also older people as well. And probably women were more likely to be working part-time, more likely to have a little bit less income to put into their pension to be able to avail of the higher matching employer contribution. So if we move from that kind of structure, which concentrates more of the employer's contribution to those who can afford to get it most, disproportionately men, to a CDC structure, which is kind of a little bit back to the past, more like DB, where it's a common structure affecting everybody, I think that would be helpful in terms of addressing the gender pensions gap.
Thanks. I mean, that's great. And it was a bad segue when you made the best of it. I'm going to come to you in a second, Peter, if I can, on that call. But I would be interested to know, whether or not CDC is exciting prospect, and if so, why?
Well, it is exciting some people in prospect, and it's exciting some of my colleagues. So the band of merry pension officers that Jack at the TUC gathers together for monthly meetings, we're all very excited. But that's because we're the people in the trade union movement who are exposed to pensions and the developments there and who know about it. I think the big question is not whether me in prospect and my counterparts and the other trade unions are excited about it. I think you would expect us to be. But I think it's whether or not we can transmit that across to the real decision makers in the trade union movement, and whether those decision makers in the trade union movement can then use their influence and bring that to bear with the decision makers, with their employers as well, in order to actually deliver enthusiasm from one person in a union headquarters in an office near Victoria to a utility company employing 15,000 people suddenly moving from DC to CDC next year or the year after, or whenever it might be.
I have your hand up, Porrick, but just before I come to you, I just wanted, you made an assumption that we would all know why the unions like CDC, but maybe we don't. Yeah, so perhaps you could just explain very briefly why unions like CDC as opposed to anything else.
I mean, there's two reasons, really. One is because it's collective, so collective defined contribution schemes, that's what trade unions are. The big influence, I mean, maybe not everyone on the call will be that exposed to trade unions, because in the private sector, there's about 2.5 million members in the private sector in trade unions in the UK today, which is about 12.5% of that workforce. Now, more like 4 million or 20% of workers in the private sector are covered by collective bargaining. So if you've ever worked for a big financial services company like, say, Aviva, that's well known to have recognition agreements with the big trade union, or if you worked in the public sector, obviously, you're probably, or if you're the head of pensions, say at a big retailer, there's lots of jobs where you will have come across trade unions and what they do and how they work. But if you've been working for a pensions consultancy all your life, you've probably never come across, how trade unions operate. And the main thing is that if you have a collective bargaining agreement, then for a proportion of that workforce, or maybe for all of that workforce, then the trade union will negotiate the pay. It's not required for there to be a collective bargaining agreement that gives the trade union rights to negotiate over pension provision. But ultimately, the trade union view is that workers are better off when they come together to collectively bargain for pay. That's when it gets down to it, besides representing workers in disciplinaries and things like that, that's the fundamental thing that trade unions do. And similarly, we believe a collective approach to pension provision is much more likely than not to be superior to an individual approach. And then, of course, you just look at the research. Now, I took a deliberate position a few years ago not to get drawn into the detail and the actuarial mathematics underpinning how collective defined contribution schemes are better. I might have been a little bit cynical and thought, well, of course, actuarial consultancies are heavily in favour of the type of pension provision that's going to require a lot more work from actuaries involved. But then as that kind of debate was going on, and I wasn't getting involved at all, You can see the monumental bad faith of some of the opponents. But when you get to the stage where you have to engage because it's the law of the land and there are practical proposals coming around, you may not believe the modelling that underpins, say, the government's announcements of returns that are up to 60% better, but you don't have to. You can see the sound, logical underpinnings for a lot of the modelling that says these outcomes are better for our members. So why on earth wouldn't you want to have that improvement in outcome for as many of your members as possible?
Okay, well, I'm very glad you said that, because it backs up something which the DWP also said. I'm pleased to see a couple of them are on this call. Hello to you both. You know who I know. And now we'll come on, as has been waiting for some time, to Porrick. And Porrick, you had a question.
Thank you. I thought Peter was in front of me, but Neil, a quick question for you. Interested in what you're saying about the benefits of CDC, potential benefits, but clearly that's something that's not going to be delivered overnight. That's in train, but DC is here now and it can be made better. What's your position from the union point of view about what's going on with the reforms? Because value for money is very much a focus of the current administration, but can we ever really get value for money for any member unless we look at adequacy now rather than kicking the can down the road? And secondly, until we get equality for or parity for women with the sex gap, then can women ever get value for money, or is the value for money objective really based on the average male? I hope that's clear what I'm asking you there.
It is, yeah. I mean, gosh, I'm not so certain about the underpinnings. There's only 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, so I pick and choose the things that I get into the weeds of. And
don't blame me.
Value for money hasn't been one of the ones I've been following so much, except for, well, you'd want more value for money than less, wouldn't you? And most of our members aren't really affected by the arguments around adequacy in relation to the minimum levels of contributions under automatic enrolment, because most of our members work for employers that offer, above median upper quartile levels of employer contributions. There's you can argue whether it's causation or correlation, but if you're in a trade union, you're probably already in a much better pension scheme than the statutory minimum levels under automatic enrolment. That said, obviously, people. There's been so many documents, from the TPR strategy documents to a lot of the stuff come out, even of the Pensions Commission, that kind of patting ourselves on the back as an industry, how well pensions are doing with the success of automatic enrolment, when really all we've done is move millions of workers with no workplace pension scheme into being millions of workers with an inadequate workplace pension scheme. And by the way, you've lost the state second pension along the way, which means I don't think we've actually done that well for that target group of workers. Hopefully CDC will help redress some of that balance if you can get more bang for the buck. But of course, getting more bang for the buck for much less buck makes even less of a difference for that target population. Hopefully the Pensions Commission will be looking at those people who are really badly served by the current system. I would argue, we have obviously argued in our submissions to the Pensions Commission, that we need, there's only really a state answer. If you've got really, really low levels of earnings, a small percentage of a small level of earnings is not by some kind of financial alchemy going to deliver adequate incomes in retirement. You can't push up the entire state pension for everyone as long as it's universal benefit. So I think maybe for those really key target workers that you need to, where adequacy is the issue, I think most of the solution has to come via the state. For the rest of our workers, our members in Prospect and across a lot of the trade union movement, adequacy isn't really the number one issue, because for my members at least, they're getting 8, 10, 12, 15, just recognised by a new organisation yesterday. I looked at their financial report. What are your pension contributions? They pay 15% as an employer contribution into a DC scheme on behalf of their members. There's like 1,600 workers there. They obviously could benefit from a CDC solution. You get a third more of your returns on a 15% contribution. That makes a much bigger difference than a third more on the statutory minimum levels under automatic enrolment.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Neil. It's a wonderful comment, I have to say that, but it is actually very good, even though it is by one of our civil servants, explaining how things are changing at DWP and a change really in the way in which you promote CDC at the CDC. I don't know if you want to say something about that comment, Thomas, or whether you leave it to people to read.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. Yeah, just to say basically, I think, and we're having this battle internally, as you can see with the press office when they ran the figure that we weren't comfortable with, nor were our analysts comfortable with, and also even with our engagement with the Pensions Commission, that when we speak to people like unions, employers, the figure, there's the kind of return that it might produce for them over DC really isn't at the forefront of their engagement with us. It's much more about, as you said, Neil, like the collectivized nature of it, the idea of the experiential stuff around you are presented with a pension. It's a pension scheme in the sense of you get an income in retirement. You're freeing people from this idea of having to make decisions at retirement, and obviously there is that just more sense of you are in your employer's pension scheme, even though it may be obviously a private sector provider that's providing it. It's this idea that you are in a pension scheme rather than just in a tax incentivized sort of DC pot thing, which most members kind of, when confronted with at retirement, obviously really don't know what it is or what to do with it. So it's kind of I think as much as I think the minister said this, however better CDC may be based on your inputs actuarially and stuff like that, is obviously significant, but it's not the main thing, or it's part of the package.
It's part of the package. It's certainly part of the package which has been heavily advertised by me, and I've been reproved by doing so by members of TBR. Who said, we don't want you to press that particular button as you were doing, Mr. Tapper. So I've slowed down, and I suddenly realised that I'm now in line with DWP's views as well. But nonetheless, over an annuity, all those actuaries and the PPI can't be totally wrong. You agree?
No, absolutely. I don't, and I think, and obviously this is the kind of space we're in now around what really needs to happen. I don't know if any of you have seen like the Gallagher report on CDC. I don't know, it came out this week or recently, and I think one of the big findings of that is there's lots of appetite, but it's having the confidence to actually do it. Again, Neil, like you were saying, it's kind of you're interested in it, you can get unions interested in it, but how do you make the decision makers actually make the decision to get into it? And I think, and obviously part of that is obviously what Royal Mail are doing and the kind of establishing CDC in the market and having an evidence base to start pointing to say, this is clearly now better for X, Y, and Z reasons. And I think, so I think that's kind of it. We've sort of laid the ground with the legislation, and now it's about establishing it and sort of hopefully establishing an evidence base. And maybe the next Pensions Commission can have a decision about whether more needs to be done to stimulate CDC.
Well, have you got a comment, Neil? I mean, we've had Gallagher, a tobacco company, aren't they? Oh no, sorry, that must be the new. Yeah, sorry, Neil.
No, I totally agree. The key issue, I think, and why I've been a bit more involved. Last year, Henry, I was probably of the opinion that if this is such a good product, a CDC is going to be deliver such better outcomes, and definitely solving the, what you do at point of retirement for members is a huge thing as well. Then surely employers are just going to pick that better product over a DC master trust once these schemes are established. I think the main reason why I've become a bit more involved and spent much more of my time talking about CDC internally within Prospect is just a conversation, Henry, we had at the very start of the year. Came back in. I thought I was going to be dealing exclusively with the civil service pensions crisis because we got tens of thousands of members in that scheme, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And we had a conversation, Henry. Just I think you just got in. We've been in touch before. You got in contact with me, and I said, well, what can the unions do about CDC? Surely employers will pick. And I think you kind of convinced me that it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. You need to have just a little bit of enthusiasm once it gets going, so that CDC gets off the ground, so that in the future more and more employers have the choice to pick from it. But unless we kind of generate a little bit of enthusiasm in the same way that Terry and the CWU worked so well with the Royal Mail to get that scheme off the ground, that it's up to some of the trade unions to try and encourage some employers who might be that way disposed anyway, to push them into becoming committed, so that some multi-employer schemes can become established, and then they're in the marketplace, and then all those other employers that don't have recognised trade unions, or a little bit behind the curve when it comes to these kind of things, because they've got businesses to run and lots of reasons why they'd be behind the curve on this, will then ultimately be able to see that at least will have the choice of a multi-employer CDC scheme to choose from if they prefer that over a DC.
I'd like to think that Prospect will have a nice long pipeline of prospects, as their name befits, and that will be passed around so that we can really see things take off. Because there are some pretty big statements being made by the pensions industry, but they don't think that CDC will take off. As one in professional pensions yesterday saying that they didn't think it would make a significant impact on UK pensions. And then on the other side, you have people like Massey at BlackRock saying that he thinks it could be a further DC can move to CDC. Which side of it are you on?
Well, the thing is, it's if I could flick a switch and make it happen in all of these companies where we got regulatory agreements, I would make it more successful. But I don't think either side really knows exactly how difficult it is to move an idea from policy people in DWP, providers in the industry, much less me and my colleagues, because we're just coming along for the ride, trying to help us at a very late stage. But to get that through, and they're not making an assessment about, they're certainly not making an assessment about the trade union enthusiasm for it, which is ultimately the member enthusiasm for it. Now, Henry, you've been to some of our executives, and you've seen, their reaction when they hear about it and their curiosity for it. And they've got busy jobs to do. Like when I used to work at the Government Actuaries Department, I had a full-time job, and then my ability to drive changes in the terms and conditions of our members at GAD, whether it be the actuarial training study package or whatever, was limited by the time I had available. Similarly, the reps that we've spoken to primarily so far in the energy sector or Prospect, which is mainly big electricity companies, they've got really, really good pension provision already, and trying to supercharge that, converting DC. There's still a lot of DB members there. They can't move out of DB schemes. They've got statutory protection for ongoing accrual of DB pension provision by and large in that industry, which is obviously a fairly unique position. But it makes it a good industry to talk to about levelling up DC from CDC, because that proportion of the workforce that still has DB provision isn't going to see that as a threat. There are certain people who are really, really enthusiastic about it and who will go and run with that in individual companies. After we had I thought, quite successful meeting just before we met Andy in Brighton at our national conference, I reckon we probably had about 100, 110 Henry reps from our union who were at that conference voluntarily come in. They had three alternatives. They could have just had their lunch. They could have gone to one of the three other fringe meetings about different topics that weren't pensions, but they came to that one about pensions to learn about CDC. And one group just happened to have their own branch's ADC a couple of weeks later, and they adopted CDC as a policy. Their policy now is to push for CDC for their members, and they're now working with the other recognised trade unions in that employer, who are some of the big trade unions that we'll all know, and they're moving But quickly, I think, actually, because things move relatively slowly in all of this, to have a joint trade union position within that employer, and then they will bring it. Now, so people who are taking a view that either it'll be a damn squib or a huge success, they're not making that assessment on the efforts of individuals and individual companies who are trying to bring this about. It'll be down to their efforts, I think, that will make it either a huge success or not. And I'm seeing more and more of them making the effort, and which gives me more and more confidence that it'll more towards the BlackRock view you described there.
Well, I'm not going to ask any more questions. That's partly because my questions aren't very good, and they just. But secondly, because there are some good questions waiting to come in, and I'm going to ask Chris Bunford to start off, and then I'll come to you, Peter. But I would like to see more questions because I know they're in your hearts to get them out. So, Chris.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks, Neil. Yes, fascinating stuff, and I agree with everything Thomas said earlier as well on that stuff. I thought it was great. The piece I wanted to pick up now was it was really interesting, your point on matching contributions, which everyone sort of naturally thinks is a really good thing, actually not being great for the gender pension gap. I was just, that got my mind wondering. We've always sort of thought of final salary being ideal and perfect and being good for things. In terms of the gender pension gap, obviously final salary benefits those whose salary goes up very quickly. As Henry mentioned, we've got a kind of unisex conversion factor table thing. Is it, I wasn't sure. I thought there was arguments two ways about whether it was good for the gender pension gap or unhelpful, because if women's salaries are leveling up, then it could be good for the gender pension gap. But if there was if it was a male dominated improvement in salaries, then it could be less good. I wasn't sure if you'd had any thoughts on that, or if anyone had kind of thoughts of whether final salary pensions were helpful for the gender pension gap, or the sort of unisex conversion factors were more beneficial.
I can see Neil coming here.
It's not something we've looked at specifically, mainly because while there are still billions, hundreds of billions, whatever, of past service liabilities with the final salary link in the public sector, for example, in the private sector, there's vanishingly few final salary schemes left. So it's just because it wasn't such a huge thing that that we could influence for the future, it hasn't been something that we looked into in depth. My prejudice is that it probably is a little unhelpful, because it's not just that there's a pay gap between the composition of different jobs, high paying and low paying by gender. It's as I said, it's more the progress, and career breaks tend to impact that. There's the motherhood penalty and all these other things. That it's the trajectory of careers that can be impacted by gender a little bit more, which seems to me to think that it suggests that the final salary link is probably unhelpful, and say a care design would be more gender neutral over a final salary link. But we've not done any particular modelling or research on that. I wouldn't even have the resources to do, even if we were reminded to.
Next year's project, eh? Thanks, Chris. Have you got is that the answer that you were looking for, or are you looking for more?
No, that's great. Thank you, Neil.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I'm going to move on to Peter Cameron Brown. Peter, keep it short. I know it'd be lovely to hear from you.
Thank you very much. Just on that pensions, gender pension gap, I had a discussion about that. And yes, as you've covered the point that care schemes probably are better, and DB is definitely better than DC, because the benefits are accrued and they are still revalued even in a career break and carried on. Indeed, many employers will continue to provide full DB benefits during maternity leave and that sort of thing, which doesn't occur with DC. So it is generally regarded as better. A slightly more facetious and general comment: can we characterize CDC as pensions Manchesterism? Manchester has this history of mutual organisations, particularly insurance unions, obviously.
First ever meeting of the TUC was in Manchester.
Yeah, quite. And that sort of thing, where they take the mutual nature of organisations and encourage that. And effectively, in the history of pensions is that a lot of the work on the Royal Mail CDC scheme was originated in Manchester. The Manchester Pension Scheme, Greater Manchester Pension Scheme, was one of the first to do localisation investments in social housing and such like.
So is that your question, Peter? But
yeah, I just wondered whether this could be seen as a view. Going on to the employer thing.
No. You're allowed one question.
I was going to say that my experience with employers is that they rely on insurance brokers to give them pensions advice and such like. And as a consequence, my experience, a lot of the employers who give fairly generous employer contributions, such as on a matching basis, are actually still stuck with GPPs as their, and I really think that needs to be addressed.
I mean, in the same way that leading Labour politicians over the last few weeks have suddenly found long, deep-seated interest in devolution in order to become aligned with our new leaders, then I think it'd be a good idea to perhaps describe CDC in far more in Manchester's terms. It would be, it couldn't do any damage. In relation to those big employers, probably the most common consultation that we've had over the last couple of years, though, has been to just as big employers have been choosing to move to master trusts from a GPP. You're absolutely right. That scheme that I talked about earlier on, which I just looked up yesterday because it's a recent recognition agreement Prospect had with the big employer. I didn't know what their pension provision was, so I just looked up their annual report. That's 15% on behalf of 1,600 members, and that's going into a GPP. So I think that there probably might be a little bit of a correlation between that, but the most common consultation that's the 60-day statutory consultation that I've seen employers undertake in the last 2-3 years has, by multiple over any other, has been a consultation about moving from a GPPP to master trust on a DC basis.
Are you able to tell us what the scheme is that you're talking about?
I bet not, because it's just an employer's GPPP, so it's I bet I talk about them specifically, but that's typical. We do have, whether it's causation or correlation, we do have an awful lot of employers who put in 10, 12, 15%, often because they used to run DB schemes, and when those schemes closed, that's where they were coming from. That was their benchmark. So when they were deciding about what to put into a DC scheme for new entrants that replaced that DB scheme, their benchmark was, well, we used to put 18, 20% into this. We put in a little bit less, but we'd still have 10, 12% going into a DC scheme.
I can doing talks on shared ambition for those employers on that basis.
Yeah, okay. John Hampton, I see you've got a question up there. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I fall into all those categories, being in the north, in the energy sector, and having worked with the cooperative movements and stuff in my history. I was just going to ask Neil, really, from a union perspective, is CDC flexible enough? Because I have got both the Energy Act protections on my ongoing accrual on DB members, and whilst they have an ability to go off with their shift DC plans and their ABCs and all the rest of it to buy annuities, we actually got a big push from the union to say, actually, we want to come across to the master trust to be able to do drawdown, because actually, if I retire at 60, I haven't got my state pension, so I actually want to take more of my DC pot early. And I see the holidays and my expenditure before I get to 75 being a lot more than it is later on. So even though they've got that underpin of the growing DB benefits, it's that flexibility they're also looking for, and I guess that's part of the debate now, isn't it? Is from a union perspective, as you say, you're led by the member choices. But I didn't know what's your view on it? Is CDC flexible enough in its current form?
Well, obviously it's not as flexible as DC, and to the members that we have that wants that flexibility, and you say about shift pay, Henry was at the first time we had a call with our senior reps who are in the prospect sector looking after electricity companies. And one of the questions was, I've done shift work, all my life. You look up the mortality statistics for shift workers, and it's nowhere near as good. You know, why would I be in this kind of collective scheme that looks at population mortality that's going to discriminate against me with much less life expectancy because of the shift work I've been doing all my life in this industry. Others, I don't think there'll be the best and the worst thing about prospect members is how much more intelligent they are than me. So it's fascinating that they can tell me about their rocket science, little rocket scientists in our membership, nuclear physicists. I've had members explain, I've gone up to a site and said, like, here, do you want to see my particle accelerator? And talk to me about everything that happened. That's fantastic. But the downside is you just can't tell them anything that they will take on faith. They will test everything. And any group of prospect members, and Harry's been in a few of them recently, you will definitely get the person who puts their hand up and says, I can invest my money better. I can make better decisions in retirement and things like that. It's hard to, but you look at the level of default, the default investment funds and such like, So from the collective point of view, they're better. They seem to me for our membership as a whole, but we will always have individuals, whether it's because they think their life expectancy will be lower because they've done shift work all their lives, or they think they can make better decisions at retirement or better investment decisions. We will always have individuals who would prefer the freedom and choice that DC has offered recently. Thankfully, it's not for me to impose any type of model or preference on any of our branches in any of our organised workplaces. I think that by and large, the vast majority of people will prefer what we think are the better, better outcomes for most people as a group. But I do think that then does mean you have to think about what are the solutions that we can give to those people who do want that individual choice as well. I mean, Henry's answered that. I've seen Henry answer that when there's been groups of prospect members answering that. There will always be in any group of people that you talk to about CDC, those who would prefer, no matter how much better it is with the collective, those who prefer the individual choice that DC can offer.
And I've seen comments coming from Julian and the DWP, which is, of course, you have the capacity to opt out of having built up a decent CETV and go off and do your thing.
Yeah. I've seen you give that answer to those members who have raised that question in conference halls and on calls as well. Yeah, but it's important that those people who feel that way, don't feel threatened by CDC coming in, against their will or anything like that.
No, everyone's an expert for 20 minutes in one of those calls.
But
default. You're absolutely right, but there you go.
But also an employer could just say, hey, here's our scheme. We're going to automatically enroll people into a CDC scheme. If you've got genuine reasons, and of course, if an employer has shift work as a matter of course, for example, and it wants to cater to those people who thought that had an impact on their mortality, well, that employer could say, well, our default is CDC for most people, but if you're one of these minority people who think you do better, there's no reason why you couldn't have a DC alternative for that person, or the flexibility that people are mentioning in the chat as well. There are solutions, I think.
No, I mean, one of the sections which we're talking to has got about 90,000 members in it, and quite clearly those workers are actually not likely to live as long as 90,000 financial services workers, and they're correctly asking whether or not they could have their own section of a CDC scheme so that the mortality that they have, which is worse than the financial sector's mortality, it benefits them and not the likes of me. And this is usually said with a glum look. And when I say you can have a section, then their faces do lighten up a little bit, because they're sharing with each other rather than with me. So anyway, I shouldn't be selling the delights of CDC, but it's hard not to. And I see two people on the call who've got their hands up, and both of them are going to be extremely important to this discussion. So first of all, let's have Bryn, or Lord Davis of Brixton, as he is better known on this call. Brit, do you want to pop in? Take yourself. That's great.
Yeah. Thanks, Neil. Everything you do. I think there's a massive change taking place in pension provision in plain sight, but people haven't really totally clocked what's happening. I've been around for a long time, and 40 years ago, we had the Tories' introduction of personal pensions, and this was the big new thing. And it's gone. It's gone. It really does not have any sort of future. There's detritus of it, but personal pensions have gone. Instead, what we've got, I'm sure everyone has read or looked at the pensions roadmap with a forward by our pensions minister, but let's hope he stays our pensions minister. And I'm just going to read you a bit of what he says. He says in this roadmap, setting out government's policies on the future of pensions, he's referring to the roadmap. This lays out our major planks of reform, setting us on course for a landscape of bigger and better pension schemes, focused on driving outcomes for workers' savings and able to invest in a wider range of assets. He goes on, this is key bit. It also addresses some well-known challenges, tackling the proliferation of small pension pots and introducing default pensions. So savers aren't left facing hugely complex financial decisions to turn their pension pot into a secure retirement. Now, that whole shift is taking place. That's the government's objective. That's what they're backing. That's what the law is going to require or push everyone towards. Require may be slightly too strong, but that's the whole thing. And this is really leading up to a question for Neil, because he's much more direct involvement in understanding what people are looking for. What Bell describes there, whether it's got a CDC label on or not, it is effectively the same as a CDC scheme, a collective scheme, not an individual scheme. Savers aren't making those complex decisions. It leads to a better and secure retirement income. What he's describing there to me sounds like CDC. And that's the way we're going. And personal pensions are history, and a good thing too.
Yeah, definitely a good thing. I mean, I think maybe the big difference is maybe, the default retirement strategy on top. So we've defaulted people into pension schemes at a default contribution rate, invested in default funds for many, many years, and then stopped just a retirement to let them, fare as well they can in the market. And obviously we've had past reports from whatever the Competition and Markets Authority used to be about, how savers just, were making terrible decisions. They weren't using the open market option, all these kind of things that just meant that these weren't good outcomes. I did mean to read Henry's blog about why Nest is effectively a CDC scheme, which would have been a very good answer, to your question. But it's one of the many things that's on my reading list that I haven't quite got around to reading it. But I think obviously that definitely appears to be the direction of travel. And particularly, I think the important thing there is at the better protection and a more collective approach at the point of retirement. If you do have to have DC, then not leaving them to the kind of outcomes that the market left savers to in the past that were so bad that competition authorities had to intervene. That's the way that's the improvement, the protection that's needed.
That's great. Thanks to both of you on that. We have one more hand up, Terry. Might be the last interjection of anyone, knowing Terry's interjections, but off you go, Terry, and see if you can keep within 5 minutes, he said.
I might struggle with 5 minutes. Morning, everyone. Yes, I might struggle with 5 minutes. Listen, I'm a very passionate man, and sometimes that comes across as angry. But there's so many things, if you're people are saying about, someone who's already saved a lot won't want to go in it, or let me tell you something obvious in a trade union. If you went to the elder workers and said to them, we're going to give you a 5% pay rise, and the people that of a lower age a 2% pay rise, them elderly people would think about voting for it. It's just obvious, but that's not what happens in a union. It's a collective, and it's what's the best for everybody, and you get the best pay deal. I've always seen pensions as terms and conditions. That's why I got into, understanding pensions. I think, honestly, for a lot of unions, I think the negotiators, the people who do make the decisions, don't necessarily understand them like a lot of people, and it frightens people away from getting into that. It's easier to, get into a pay deal, it's instant, and someone would say, I prefer that pay deal, rather than standing your ground and saying this is in the interest of everybody and their future, because DC schemes are not pensions. So let's just ditch that right from the off. This is the problem in the conversations we're having here. They are not pension schemes, they are saving schemes, and the theory is that at the end of that, you buy an annuity and you get a wage in retirement. Some people run off with their lump sum, but actually that doesn't, I don't think that drives the best behaviours. Many people have done that and then regretted it. We had people come out of DB schemes in the past to go into individual schemes against the union's advice, and they've deeply regretted it. People need a wage in retirement. So from my point of view, trade unions, it should be absolutely up there on the top of their list. As a trade unionist, you want the best for the people you represent, the best pension, the best terms and conditions, the best hours of employment, etc., the best pay. Of course you do. But I think it gets dropped off, as I say, because I think a lot of people think it's too difficult to understand. I wonder what I'm talking about. Instead of surrounding themselves with experts, I am so glad that whatever it is was in me, because listen, I'm not the brightest crown in the box, I'm no intellect, but I just knew that DC scheme wasn't right for people and stuck to my guns. Because if I'd listened to all the experts and all the CEOs and all the other top managers in Royal Mail, we wouldn't even be having this debate now, because the CD scheme at Royal Mail wouldn't be in there. Now, suddenly, that's changed. Suddenly there are really, the experts are coming round and talking about it. You guys are talking about it, are actually saying it is better and it would produce 60% more. So what it tells me is you don't always have to know about it. You have to have that feeling of why can't we create something better? And obviously them experts, all they needed was a kick up the jacksie. And I don't know about this. I don't know about this Manchesterism. I'll call it Millwallism, if you like. I
call it yovelism. It's yodel.
But the point is this: I think if you do, there are calculations that say if somebody earns X, then what they will need in retirement is Y, and that's the sum they're looking to generate to run alongside their state pension to give them some sort of, decent financial security in old age and avoid pensioner poverty. And I say this because regardless of what people say about a triple lock, and you try living, if that's all you've got coming in and you've still got rent to pay and things like that, you try living on the state pension. So if that calculation is done, that informs the contribution. Now, in my opinion, if you're going to arrive at the same place, the contribution you'd have to pay in a DC scheme to arrive at that position is far more than you'd have to pay into a CDC scheme to reach that same position. So if you pick up people now that have got, half decent rates of contribution going into a DC, they're going to be far better off, right? But if you're setting out, if the formula was, this is what you need to arrive at, then that would inform what the contributions need to be. Because, listen, union density in this country is nowhere near where I'd want it to be. There are far many big employers that don't recognise trade unions, or if they do, they only, they play lip service to it. Big employers, Amazon, all these big people out there. Then we've also got to win them over. And the argument has got to come from, a full circle of people. The opinion formers aren't just trade unions. But of course, I would love it if trade unions were fighting heavily for it. But the opinion formers is in the industry, it's in government. You know, Burnham's just got elected. He stands there and says we want a 10-year plan for the country, etc. Why don't people see DC is like the king's wearing no clothes? To me, it's like it hasn't worked. It's failed. It needs to change. It may suit some individual who's a brilliant investment manager who knows what they're doing, but a vast majority of people don't know what they're doing, don't even know what they're getting at the end of the line. So, you know, arguably pensions should be a bit nanny state. But the argument is so damn obvious. The only reason there'll be resistance, and we will constantly be attacked, is because these insurance companies have made millions off of the backs of people in DC schemes. And they don't want to lose that. But what this is about is people having a genuine chance of a decent retirement, financial security in retirement, in a world where people are at retirement age have still got mortgages, are still having to pay rent because they've never been able to get onto the property ladder, etc., etc. This is something that I think it will be seen as a major shift in the social history of this country. And that's why people should be arguing it so strongly. So all the if, buts and maybes, they can be ironed out. Why wasn't all of this applied to DC? Why is it still in existence?
Terry, you've got to give us all a chance to answer that. Magnificent.
Sorry.
Try, but you know, Neil first, because it's your call, Neil.
Well, of course, I'd agree with most of that, and I think just to pick out what Terry was saying, that key people are negotiators with the trade unions that deal with each of these employers. In my experience, they are incredibly open. They don't know nothing about it from scratch. Why would they? You have a conversation and they go, well, I can see why that would benefit my members. How do I bring it about? Now, the problem with them is that they're the busiest people I've ever met in my life, and the possibility of them, having to do employment tribunals, pay talks, disputes, everything else that has to go on, is really difficult. So what I'm trying to do is figure out ways, how do I influence them, and maybe getting their manager to hold people to account to, have you raised this with the employer? What is it that the employer has said? Why is there a stumbling block from this, going any further with this big electricity company or whatever it might be? So that's my particular difficulty. The trade union negotiators are, once you've spoken to them about it, can absolutely see, Terry, all the advantages that you set out, and of course the problems with the DC schemes as they exist. Interestingly, I think on the other side of the table, there's far more cynicism and terrible answers from heads of pensions at big utility companies and other big employers across the piece, and much less open-mindedness about it. At the end of the day, I don't think that's necessarily a huge problem, because the head of pensions isn't going to decide the total remuneration strategy of a big employer. They're going to sit down where they have recognition and collective bargaining with the trade unions, not just prospect with the joint trade union side. They'll sit down and they'll talk about that. And they'll effectively be bypassed if they don't want to get on and be open-minded about it. But in my experience, and I've not really spoken to too many company officials or employee side. I've been in a few conversations with like finance directors and heads of organisations where you kind of just throw it into the mix, and you can see them being quite curious. But the conversations I've heard it back indirectly from heads of pensions at big employers, where you would have thought they'd know a bit more about it than my colleagues who were negotiating the whole range of terms and conditions with them. That's where I think there's a bit more cynicism that I'm hearing back. But at the end of the day, that won't really matter too much. It'll be down to people like you, Terry, in companies and trade unions. We're working with companies all across up and down the country, making an individual as employer by employer.
That's great. A couple of things in the comments I just wanted to bring in. The first, and we have such rare contributions from any one of the female sectors, Natalia Kovlova, and I really want you to come on this and talk, Natalia, because you keep on making these great comments. Do you want to say what you said, or do you want me to read it for you? I will say it. I was interested in the answer to that question as well. This is to do with the problem about the gender pension gap. Yes, to some extent, the shift from DB to DC has generally widened the gender pension gap because DC pensions depend more directly on lifetime earnings and continuous contributions. Since women are more likely to have lower pay, part-time work and career breaks for caregiving, they tend to accumulate smaller pension pots. However, the impact varies across countries. In countries such as Sweden and Denmark, strong redistributive policies and pension credits for caregiving have helped limit or reduce the gender pension gap despite greater reliance on DC type schemes. Can I say well said?
Absolutely. And just to say, Henry, OECD came out with a report last year. We put the table in our gender pension gap report this year as well that shows that the UK had the second biggest gender pensions gap of any of the OECD countries. And part of the reason is, yeah, we do have credits for the state pension, but we don't have anything to replace that workplace pension that you haven't built up while you were out of paid employment or working part-time because of your caring responsibilities, which disproportionately fall on women. So that's the main reason why the gender pensions gap in the UK was the second highest of the OECD countries, as found in their report. I think it came out just before Christmas last year.
Thank you. And finally, from our old friend, Johnny Timpson. Johnny, I haven't seen you put your hand up, so I'll say it for you. Agree with Lord Davis and Neil, important too that we ensure consumers have the support needed to make informed decisions, hence as part of a guided retirement. Better, I suggest we call it guided wage in retirement. That's to you, Mr. Terry Pullinger. I suggest we call it guided wage in retirement. Journey we proactively offer pension-wise, again, let's rebrand it wage in retirement-wise support. Thank you very much for that. I haven't heard anyone talk about CDC in conjunction with pension-wise. What's your thought on that, Neil, before we finish?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you would want a system where people don't, there can be just a default that they don't even have to engage. But clearly, yeah, better support as well would only be to members' benefit.
Yeah, I think it's one we should take up and do something with because nobody's said anything about it so far. We've got to do something with that very well-staffed but underused service. Okay, so thanks very much. We've got to an end. We've run out of questions, and we're at a point where I think we just have to turn around and say thank you to everyone who's contributed today, but especially to Neil. So can we give him one of those huge rounds of applause from our assembled clutch? It's lovely to see so many people staying on to the very end. And now back to you, Steve, because you can do your usual thing.
Yeah, no, I just want to say thanks, Neil. Fantastic session. We'll get the video up by lunchtime today, Neil. Thank you very much indeed for your input, and thanks to everyone for your questions. Absolutely fantastic. We will have another session next week, so watch out for the invite for that, which will include the Association of Member-Nominated Trustees. So they're going to do a session with Bobby Ridaway. So be prepared for an invite for next week. But thank you all for joining. I really, really hope you enjoyed the session. CDC, as Bryn was saying, sounds like it could be the answer. And I do remember July '88 when the new personal pension regs came in. I was on a sun lounger in Africa at the time, and I thought, oh my God, here we go. But anyway, yeah, let's move forward. Terry, I love your passion, your emotion, and I love lots and lots of lovely questions. Please continue to support PayPen. We really appreciate your attendance today, and enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your week, and let's pray as usual for peace in the East, and hope the Russians don't bomb Plymouth with their guns, as some of you may have seen in the news today. But there we go. See you later on. Enjoy, and thanks everyone for all your input. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Bye.
Cheers, Neil. Thanks. Bye.